Welcome to our lesson on Chapter 19. In this chapter, we're going to take a look at government borrowing and national savings. I'm going to leave the government borrowing and its effect on trade balances and vice versa to you to do for self-study. But let's talk a little bit about most of the chapter, actually. We'll have a good amount of time for it today. So the first thing to think about is when a government spends more than it receives in tax revenues, it needs to borrow. So if government spending is greater than tax revenues, we know that this figure will be less than zero. That means that tax revenues are not significant enough this means that government revenues in the form of tax revenues won't be sufficient enough to cover all of the government expenditures. So G minus T represents the fact that we would have a government budget deficit here. One thing to think about is, how does government borrowing affect investment and trade? We know that the government can run a budget deficit so that its expenditures can exceed its tax revenues. But does this have an effect on the total amount of investment or the trade that's done in an economy? So we're still kind of considering our equation. GDP is a function of consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. Therefore, if the government wants to borrow more, so increase its borrowings because government expenditures are greater than tax revenues, then it must borrow. And where does it get the funds to do this? So it can issue debt. And when the government issues debt, somebody has to buy that debt. So households can save more. They can buy the debt that the government has issued to cover its budget deficit. Private firms might borrow less. So if they're borrowing less, households are able to shift their savings from corporations who are borrowing into now buying public debt or debt of the U.S. government. In addition, foreign financial investors can step in and buy our debt. So when the government issues debt, and they're issuing debt in the form of bonds, U.S. Treasury bonds, they need to be purchased by somebody, and they're either going to be purchased by U.S. households who want to save more, U.S. households who are shifting their purchases from the purchases of corporate bonds to U.S. Treasury bonds, or from foreigners. We're going to look at our national savings and investment identity here. So this is a little bit of a refresher since you already are aware of what these terms mean. But let's consider several options. So if we have a budget deficit, the government is going to be acting as a borrower. That is, the government expenditures are greater than their tax revenues. And so in our investment identity, we know that the quantity supplied of financial capital equals the quantity demanded of financial capital. So financial capital is supplied by households and it's demanded by firms. In this case, it's also going to be demanded by the foreign government, or by the U.S. government, because the U.S. government is a borrower because it has a budget deficit, because its government expenditures are greater than its tax revenue. So our identity becomes the quantity supplied of financial capital is all of the savings that is done by households, so private savings. Any inflow of foreign savings, so the inflow of foreign savings means that we're running a trade deficit. And the demand for financial capital is now coming from businesses. So this is private investment that is done by businesses. They are demanding it to make investments such as buy machinery and tools and factories, etc. And Government expenditures minus taxes would show that our government expenditures exceed our tax revenue. And so that amount by which government expenditures are greater than tax revenue represent our government budget deficit and represent the amount that will need to be borrowed by the U.S. government. So this organization of our formula is representative of when the budget is in deficit, when we're spending more than we're receiving in tax revenue. The next sort of situation is when there is a budget surplus. So essentially the government is going to be acting as a saver. And so our formula changes around a little bit. We're going to move our government variables from the right-hand side of the equation to the left, because the equation is, again, the quantity supplied of financial capital must equal the quantity demanded of financial capital in equilibrium. So the quantity supplied of financial capital is a function of the total household savings, so private savings as represented by S. And yet we might still have a trade deficit. If we have a trade deficit, this would represent an inflow of foreign investment. So M minus X would be positive here as we're importing more than we're exporting. And now the government is also going to be able to supply financial capital. And this is represented by the fact that our tax revenues are now greater than our government expenditures. And so we've shifted those variables from the right-hand side of the equation to the left-hand side of the equation. And therefore, the only demanders of financial capital are going to be businesses who are performing private investment. And the next way we can sort of think of a different scenario would be what happens when we are running a trade surplus. So a trade surplus means that actually we are exporting more than we're importing. And when we're exporting more than we're importing, we are receiving more income for our exports than we're having to pay out for imports. And we receive those funds in foreign currencies generally. Now, when we have that excess cash coming from foreign countries from our exports, we then will send it outside of the country as an outflow of financial capital. So that trade surplus will move to the right-hand side of the equation. Here we have both a government budget deficit and a trade surplus. So the only source of financial capital or supply of financial capital would come from private investors, which would be individuals or households, and this will be private savings as represented by S. Investment will be all private investment that's done by businesses and companies. And our government budget deficit will be where our government expenditures are greater than our tax revenues. And so that amount of the government budget deficit is how much we will actually have to finance with the issuance of treasuries that need to be purchased by somebody. And so here they're going to be purchased by private households. So investment is businesses issuing corporate bonds. G minus T is the government budget deficit, or the government issuing U.S. treasuries, and X minus M showing that we have a trade surplus representing an outflow of financial capital, so a demand for financial capital. So these equations are very interesting to take a look at and be able to apply to the different scenarios of whether we are experiencing budget deficits or trade surpluses, and apply them to the rest of the material in our lesson. So something to think about is when the government is borrowing, when government expenditures are greater than the total tax revenue that is generated, this can have the potential for what is called crowding out. And crowding out is when government borrowing soaks up the available financial capital and leaves less for private investment and physical capital. So in the simplest form, we know that savings equals investment. And therefore, when the government is going to be issuing treasuries, it's taking away. If savings doesn't change, then what must happen? I must fall as the government issues, so G minus T So G minus T represents a deficit where our expenses are greater than our revenues. You could think about it as your expenses in your house are greater than you're receiving in your income, because tax revenue is the income for the government. And therefore there's a deficit, and they'll have to issue treasuries. So some of that treasury issuance can soak up some of the supply of financial capital that's coming from households. And when this happens, we can sometimes see that government borrowing can have an effect on crowding out in private investment in physical capital, while a reduction in government borrowing can offer private investment a chance to expand. And the reason for this is that when the demand for financial capital increases, so we see that we're dealing with the right-hand side of the equation here, and we're looking at demand. When the demand for financial capital increases, the quantity supplied is going to increase too, but what we're going to see is they're now going to demand that supply that they're going to give be at a higher rate of interest because the demand is greater. And that can sort of crowd out some businesses. If you think of a good example, a company might be very sensitive to their cost of borrowing, right? They take out a large loan with an interest rate and hope to pay it back. Pay back that loan with the profits and revenues they receive on whatever sort of investment they're making to produce some very profitable project. Now, if interest rates rise high enough, that project may no longer become profitable to them. And so some private investment might drop out. Some projects might become no longer feasible due to higher interest rates. And so this is essentially what crowding out is. Crowding out doesn't always happen. It's just a potential scenario that when the government borrows, it may crowd out private investment. So something to think about is, how does the government make investments? So when we're looking at our equation of government expenditure, or GDP, total real GDP equals the total consumption of goods and services, the total investment in different items by businesses to produce profitable enterprise, the total expenditures by government. Some government expenditures are not just government expenditures per se that are not related to investment, but we also have, we have under this G variable, we have expenses that the government has. They need to pay administrative personnel that work in the White House, for example. And we also have another component, and that would be called public investment. So while I comprises private investment, G also is expenses of the government, but also public investment. So what is public investment specifically? Public investment can be in different items. The government can invest in physical capital, such as roads and bridges. It can build access to new and better improved water supplies, better sewers that are better for the environment, and new areas that are under development. The government might also be building seaports or airports, schools and hospital, plants that generate electricity like hydroelectric dams or nuclear power or windmills. They might build telecommunications facilities, and they also construct weapons that are used for the military. So there are quite a bit of physical capital items that the government may be investing in to do things such as, roads and bridges make it more efficient to get from point A to point B. If it's more efficient to get a truckload of produce from point A to point B, it takes less time and less fuel. Well, then we know that companies who use those roads will be more profitable, and then they'll be able to increase their supply if they're more profitable. So investments in physical capital that the government makes are extremely important. But it's also hard to draw a general lesson about how much government investment in physical capital will benefit the economy, because the government acts differently than a business. A business decides to do something over another thing, over not doing anything, because it sees that it is possibly profitable. It does an analysis to say, how much can I sell at what price, and what are my costs, and will I earn a profit, and then decides to move forward if they're going to be profitable. But the government is very different. The government responds to political incentives. They might be responding to economic incentives, like the example I gave about the roads and bridges. If we put a road between this town and that town, it's going to increase efficiency for so many businesses, and they'll be able to increase supply. supply, and therefore prices will be lower for consumers, they may do that type of analysis. But they might also do a type of analysis that is really just based on different political incentives. So I'm going to make the water supply better for this one community because I can get a lot of votes this way, but maybe it's not going to change so much and it's going to cost a lot of money to do so. Perhaps I'm going to put an airport into a very small municipality where it's not going to be used too frequently and it's not going to increase business. There aren't going to be so many travelers, but I'm just doing it because there are some powerful voters in that particular area. So it is a little bit difficult to ascertain just how important government investment can be in certain physical capital items because we don't really know whether a sure economic analysis has been done to see if it will really be a useful project or not. Another issue with government investments is sometimes they are excessively costly. So because the government has very deep pockets, they end up paying a good bit of money for many things, especially as it relates to, sometimes military projects are extremely expensive. They're using cutting edge technology. These different companies who are contracted by the U.S. government to produce military items. So there might be some, and there's really no incentive by the government to be concerned about whether it's a profitable project, right? Because really creating some sort of military implement saves lives, and we don't really put a dollar figure on that. So it's just a very different way of looking at whether to undertake the building of a road or a bridge or a certain weapon for a military sort of combat situation than it would be for a firm who says, well, I'm going to buy this piece of machinery because it's going to make me more efficient and cause me to earn more profits. The government also invests human capital into human capital. So they do this through education primarily. They are spending money on K through 12 and higher education. But one thing we've noticed is we don't actually see a huge correlation between spending more money per child and spending less, because we're not actually seeing a huge increase in student performance when we increase the amount of money we spend per child. So this is a really interesting thing to think about, especially as we are in a political year and we do hear a lot about increasing the funding that goes towards education. Well, will this actually increase the skills and intelligence of our available human capital pool to produce more innovative and interesting and creative products to make us a real, allow us to stay abreast financially and economically as a world power? We don't always see this in the data. The other thing that the government can make investments in is technology. So the government can use fiscal policy, so strategically increasing government spending in one area or another to encourage research and development. And they can do this with direct spending or tax policies. So they could allow for tax credits for people who are purchasing electric vehicles, for example. If I buy an electric vehicle, I get a tax deduction or tax credit. And I'm not sure which one it is. But if I get that tax deduction or tax credit on that electric vehicle, that supposedly will probably increase the consumption of those vehicles. And if the demand for those vehicles increases, then so does the supply. And that makes it not only more profitable for manufacturers of electric vehicles, but they might also, they're expanding their production. And it's therefore a strategic technology area for the federal government. Now, something really important to think about is that when we have a budget deficit, so if you look at our identity, here is a good example, this one where we have the budget deficit. We see that our savings, and in this case we also have a trade surplus, so we're receiving an inflow of foreign financial capital. But one could say, well, is it possible that if government expenditures were to increase, and so the government is a borrower, and they're going to have to issue treasury debt to cover their gap between their what their expenses are for the year and how much they receive in tax revenues, well, could this be covered, primarily by an increase in savings? Maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. Let's take a look. So a higher budget deficits means for people that I'm going to owe more taxes in the future. If I know the government is running a budget deficit and they're having to issue a bunch of treasuries and the government budget deficit and the national debt is just increasing, well, I might assume that they're going to use tax revenues in the future. So increase my taxes in the future and I'm going to have to pay higher taxes. So what I might do now is save more now so that when taxes are higher, when I don't have the ability to save because taxes are so high, I will have the amount of savings I need for retirement, for example. On the flip side, I might rationalize that if the government runs a budget surplus, that there'll be a tax cut in the future. And so I won't need to save as much now because I'll be able to save more in the future. So there's some thought as to, well, if there's a budget deficit and I'm going to owe more taxes in the future, I'll save more. And so when there's that budget deficit, am I saving more? And when there's a budget surplus where we don't need to be saving as much, are we saving less? So individuals would save more during a deficit and spend more during a surplus. And this would also signify that we might not have the issues we see with crowding out, because as that savings increases, then, ceteris paribus, the total amount of private investment that's going on is not going to need to be altered. So if you take a look at our equation, let's say that we're holding exports and we're holding the trade balance constant right now, so it's not changing. But if savings is increasing, along with an increase in our government budget deficit or the amount of treasuries that need to be issued, then perhaps we don't have to worry about crowding out our private investment. So that's a good thing. And what we call this is Ricardian equivalence. So Ricardian equivalence is the theory that rational private households might shift their savings to offset government saving or borrowing. But what we see in reality is that this doesn't actually happen very much. So the funds do need to come from somewhere. Whether we have crowding out, we have to take a look. Do interest rates actually rise? Do we see that government demand for financial capital is so large that we do have increases in interest rates? And there's other ways to keep the interest rate low when this happens, but then we would not have crowding out. We also could think about, and I urge you to take a look at this in the textbook. So take a look at how government borrowing and the trade balance interact. How do these two variables interact? So if we have increases in government deficits, so government expenses are much greater than taxes, and we're saying that savings doesn't change that much, what happens to this variable? And what happens to this variable? They're pretty interesting things to take a look at. So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on government borrowing and national savings. You are welcome to discuss in the discussion forum posts chapter 18 or 19, whichever you prefer. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I look forward to speaking to you. If you have any questions, please make sure to reach out.